I never thought I'd be back here, in this apartment, sleeping in the same bed I slept in for 20 years before my wife passed, staring at the same water stain on the ceiling that I kept meaning to fix and never did. And the only reason I'm back is because my own daughter asked me to leave, and I keep telling myself she didn't mean it the way it felt, and maybe she didn't. But that doesn't change the fact that I packed a bag at 61 years old with a heart that my cardiologist says can't be trusted, and Emily offered to drive me, and I told her no. I told her I was fine, because that's what I do. I don't let people help me when I should, and I drove myself back to this place alone. And now I'm lying here at whatever time it is, and I can't sleep, so I'm just going to say this out loud, or type it out, or whatever this is, because I've been turning it over in my head for 3 weeks, and it hasn't gotten any quieter. About 8 months ago, I started having these episodes, dizziness mostly, sometimes a heaviness in my chest that would come and go, and I ignored it for longer than I should have, because that's what I do. I wait. I see if it resolves on its own. I don't want to make a big deal out of nothing. And then one morning I sat down on the bathroom floor because I was too dizzy to stand, and I thought, okay, this is probably something, and it was. My doctor ran a bunch of tests and sat across from me with that particular expression that doctors get when they're about to tell you something that changes your afternoon plans. And he said my heart was irregular in a way that needed monitoring, and that living alone right now was not a great idea. And he wasn't wrong. I know he wasn't wrong. But hearing it still felt like something had shifted under me, like the version of myself I thought I was had just quietly stepped out of the room. I didn't tell Emily right away because I didn't want her to panic. She worries. She's always worried. Even when she was a kid, she was the one who checked if the doors were locked. And when I finally told her, she drove to my apartment that same evening and sat next to me on the couch and held my hand and said, "Dad, you're moving in with us. That's not even a discussion." And the way she said it, so certain, like it was already done, I almost didn't say anything. I almost just nodded, but I told her I didn't want to be in the way. I told her they were still newlyweds basically, only 2 years married, and she shook her head and said there was nothing to discuss, and that was that. I want to be honest about this part because I think it matters. I was relieved. I didn't want to be alone when those dizzy spells came. I didn't want to fall in my bathroom at 61 and not have anyone know for 3 days. So I said yes, and I moved into their guest room. And for the first month or so, things were actually fine, genuinely fine. We had dinner together most evenings. Emily would cook or we'd order something. Sometimes we'd watch something on TV after, and Jason seemed okay with it. He was cordial. He'd ask me questions about my health. He seemed concerned. In the way you seem concerned about something when it's not your problem yet. And I felt useful in small ways. I'd take out the trash. I'd fix a cabinet hinge that had been loose. I'd be there when Emily got home, and we'd talk for a few minutes before Jason got back. And it felt like something I hadn't felt in a long time, which was just being part of a household again. And I was aware that I was an old man in someone else's space, and I tried very hard not to take up more room than I needed. And then one evening, maybe 5 or 6 weeks in, I was in the kitchen getting a glass of water, and Jason came in, and he asked Emily if she'd taken the money from the side table, and Emily said no. And he said there'd been about $300 there from the ATM, and it was gone. And he said it in that way that's not quite an accusation, but it's not quite not one either. Just, that's strange. And Emily said she hadn't touched it, and he said, okay, weird, and that was it. Conversation over. But I noticed that he didn't look at me when he said it. Or maybe I noticed that he very deliberately didn't look at me. I'm not sure which is worse. I went back to my room and I thought about it for a while, and I told myself I was reading into things. People lose track of their own cash all the time. I've done it. It probably just got moved or he miscounted or something. I told myself I was being paranoid, and I let it go. Then maybe 4 or 5 days after that, Jason made a comment at dinner, just casually, not directed at me specifically. He was talking about something else, and he said, "It's hard when you're the only one bringing money in." And it was a passing remark. He moved on immediately, but the air in the room changed for a second. Emily shifted in her seat, and I kept eating, and I didn't say anything, because what was I going to say? He wasn't wrong that I wasn't contributing financially. I was living there for free, and I'm not the kind of person who makes a scene over a comment that technically had an innocent explanation, so I let that go too. But Emily didn't let it go, at least not completely, because later that night she told him directly. I could hear them talking from the hallway. She said, "That's not my dad," with enough certainty that I had to sit down for a second, Because hearing your daughter defend you without even being asked is one of those things that matters more than it should, or maybe exactly as much as it should. I don't know. I thought after that it would settle, whatever this was would settle, but it didn't. Over the next week or two, Jason started bringing it up differently. Never angry, never loud, always reasonable, always careful, and I could hear pieces of it. Not everything. Just enough. He'd say things like he wasn't blaming anyone. He just wanted them to be realistic. He'd say the money kept disappearing and they had to think about what was actually possible. And I understood what he was doing. I understood it clearly. I just didn't know how to say that without sounding like I was the one making accusations. And then one evening, Emily came to my room and she stood in the doorway for a second before she sat down, and she had this look on her face that I recognized from when she was a teenager and had to tell me something she didn't want to tell me. And she said, "Dad, I have to ask you something." And then she asked me if I had taken the money, and I sat there for a moment because I genuinely needed a moment, not because I was angry. I wasn't angry right then. I was just surprised by how much it hurt. To hear her actually ask it, to hear the question come out of her mouth, and I said, "Do you actually think I would do that?" And she said no immediately. She said no and she started crying and said she just had to ask. She had to. And she said, "I believe you." And she meant it. I believe she meant it, but she'd still asked. And once a question like that gets asked, it doesn't fully go away. It just sits there in the corner of the room. After that, things got tense in a way that was hard to explain to someone who wasn't there. Nothing dramatic, nobody yelling, just this low-level electricity in the house. Emily looking tired all the time, Jason being very polite in a way that felt like effort. And then one afternoon I walked past the living room and saw some bills sitting on the coffee table, clearly visible. And 2 days later, Jason told Emily they were gone. And this time he said, "I don't feel safe in my own home." And I heard that from down the hall, and something in me just went quiet. Not the good kind of quiet, the kind where you realize the thing you were hoping wouldn't happen is already happening. Emily came to me that night, and she was a mess. She'd been crying, her eyes were swollen, and she sat across from me and she said, "Dad, I don't know what's true anymore." And I didn't say anything for a second because there was nothing to say that was going to fix anything in that moment. And then she said maybe it would be better if I went back to my apartment for a while, just temporarily. And she looked like she was breaking apart saying it. She didn't look like someone who wanted me gone. She looked like someone who had run out of options and didn't know it yet. And I told her it was okay. I told her I understood. Because I did understand. She was between two people she loved, and she was exhausted, and she was scared, and the easiest thing to fix in that moment was me. So I told her okay, and I packed my bag and I drove back here. And I walked into this apartment with its dust, and its silence, and its familiar smell of a place that had been closed up too long. And I took my medication out of my bag and put it on the table because that's the first thing I do now. And I sat down on the bed and I thought about the fact that my daughter had just asked me to leave her house because someone had convinced her, slowly and carefully, and without ever raising his voice, that she couldn't be sure about me. And that was the first time I really understood that being innocent doesn't protect you from anything. I want to say that the first week back here wasn't that bad. I want to say that. But it was bad, not in a dramatic way, just in the quiet, practical way that bad things usually are when you're 61 and living alone with a heart condition and a bottle of medication on the nightstand. I woke up the first morning and I lay there for a few minutes trying to remember if I had any food in the refrigerator, and I didn't. I hadn't lived here in almost 3 months, so there was nothing, and I drove to the grocery store and I walked around it slowly because my energy wasn't what it used to be, and I came home and put things away, and I made myself something to eat, and I sat at the kitchen table alone and I thought, okay, this is what this is now. And I told myself I could manage it. I'd managed alone before. For years after my wife died, I managed alone. So I told myself this was just going back to something I already knew how to do. But the health stuff was harder than I wanted to admit. I'd had a couple of dizzy spells in those first 2 weeks. Nothing that put me on the floor, but the kind where you have to stop and hold on to something and wait for it to pass. And my doctor had said these would probably keep happening until we found the right adjustment for my medication. And when it happened in Emily's house, there was always someone nearby, even if I never said anything. Just knowing someone was in the next room was different. And now when it happened, I just stood at the kitchen counter and held on and waited, and that was fine. I was fine, but I thought about what my doctor had said, and I understood again why he'd said it. I didn't call Emily for the first 10 days. I thought about calling her every day. I picked up the phone a few times, but I always put it back down. And I think the reason, if I'm being honest with myself, is that I was afraid, not of her exactly, but of what might still be in her voice, some version of uncertainty, some small hesitation, and I didn't know what I would do if I heard that. So I just didn't call. I told myself I was giving her space, but really I was protecting myself from a conversation I didn't know how to have yet. She called me on day 11. It was a short call. She asked how I was feeling. I said fine. She said she was thinking about me. I said I know. And there was a pause that lasted a little too long, and then we said goodbye, and that was it. And I sat with the phone in my hand for a minute after, because it wasn't a bad call, nothing was wrong with it, but it didn't feel like us. It felt careful, like two people being polite to each other at a work function. And I thought about how we used to talk. Really talk. About her mother, about her job, about small things that didn't matter, and I wondered how long it would take to get back to that, or whether we would. Meanwhile, I didn't know what was happening in their house. Emily didn't tell me much on those short calls, and I didn't ask. But sometime around the end of the second week, she called me, and she sounded different, not upset exactly, more like someone who is concentrating very hard on staying calm. And she said Jason had been spending money lately in ways that didn't make sense to her. He'd bought things, electronics, some clothes, stuff that showed up without much explanation, and when she asked him about it, he got vague. And she said she wasn't trying to read into it, but it was bothering her. And I listened, and I didn't say anything beyond asking her what she thought. And she said she didn't know. And then she changed the subject. And I let her change the subject, because that's what she needed to do. I thought about that call a lot over the next few days. I thought about what it meant that money was still disappearing in some direction after I'd left. And I thought about Jason's very reasonable, very calm, very logical way of pointing a finger without ever actually pointing a finger. And I turned it over, and I told myself I was biased. I was the one who'd been asked to leave, so of course I was going to construct a version of events that made me the victim. Maybe I was missing something. Maybe there was context I didn't have. I tried very hard to be fair to him inside my own head, which is maybe a strange thing to have to work at, but I worked at it. And then Emily called me on a Thursday evening. I remember it was evening because the light was going outside my window, and she sounded different from all the other calls. Not calm, not careful, something else. She said she'd found something. She said it in a way that made me stop what I was doing and just listen. And she told me she'd been going through some paperwork at home, and she'd found a credit card statement, not one of their joint accounts, a separate card she hadn't known about, and on it were cash advance withdrawals, several of them, going back weeks, amounts that matched up in a way that was hard to ignore. And she'd gone to Jason and put it in front of him and asked him to explain it. And he'd been quiet for a long time. And she said, "Tell me this isn't what I think it is." And he said it wasn't. And she kept asking, and eventually he admitted it. He said he'd been taking cash out and staging it around the house so it would look like it was disappearing. He said he'd done it because he wanted me to leave. He said he thought if there was enough pressure I'd go on my own and nobody would have to have a difficult conversation. And Emily said she stood there and didn't say anything for a full minute. She just stood there, and then she called me. She was crying on the phone, not the kind of crying where you can still talk normally, the kind where you have to stop between sentences, and she said, "I should have believed you." And I didn't say anything right away. I didn't have anything ready. I just sat there in my apartment holding the phone, and she said she was so sorry. She said it more than once, and I told her I knew. I told her it was okay. I told her the things you say, and I meant most of them. I meant that I wasn't angry at her. I meant that I understood she'd been put in an impossible position by someone she trusted. I meant all of that. But there was still something sitting in my chest that wasn't anger and wasn't sadness exactly. It was more like a tiredness, the kind that comes from knowing that something got broken during a time when you were too sick and too tired to stop it. And that even though the truth had come out, even though she now knew what had actually happened, I had still spent 3 weeks in this apartment alone, going to the grocery store slowly, holding on to counters during dizzy spells, waiting for phone calls that felt careful and polite and nothing like my daughter, and the truth coming out didn't take those 3 weeks back. It just explained them. And I'm not sure explanation is the same thing as repair, though I'm still figuring that out. The divorce wasn't fast. These things never are. And I only knew pieces of it because Emily didn't tell me everything, and I didn't ask for everything. She'd call sometimes and I could hear in her voice that she'd been having a hard day, and I'd listen. And sometimes she'd say something specific, and sometimes she'd just talk around it. and I understood that she was processing something that I wasn't fully inside of. This was her marriage ending, her life reorganizing itself in ways she hadn't planned for, and my job in those calls was just to be there, not to have opinions, not to say I told you so, not to do anything except be her father, which is the one thing in this whole situation I never stopped being even when I wasn't sure of anything else. She filed about 6 weeks after that phone call. She told me it wasn't a decision she made quickly. She said she tried to think about whether what he did was something a marriage could come back from. She said she sat with that question for a long time. And I believe her. Emily is not someone who quits things. She never was. She was the kid who finished every book she started even if she didn't like it. She stayed in jobs longer than she should have. She believed in working through things, so when she said she'd made her decision, I knew she hadn't made it lightly, and I didn't try to talk her in either direction because it wasn't mine to decide. What I thought about, more than the divorce itself, was what it cost her, not financially, though that was real too, but the other kind of cost, the one you pay in sleep and in appetite, and in the way you move through your days when something you built is coming apart. She lost weight during those months. I could see it when she came to visit. Her face looked different, tired in a specific way, and she had this habit she'd developed of pausing in the middle of sentences like she was checking herself before she finished the thought, and I recognized that habit because I'd had it too, at different points in my life. It's what you do when you've been in a situation where saying the wrong thing had consequences, and it made me sad to see it in her, not angry, just sad. She came to see me one afternoon in the middle of all of it. She hadn't called ahead. She just showed up, and I opened the door, and she stood there for a second, and then she looked past me into the apartment. She looked at the small living room and the kitchen visible from the doorway, and the medication on the table, and the old furniture that hadn't moved in years, and something changed in her face. Not dramatically, just a small shift, like something she'd been holding at a slight distance had just gotten closer. And she came in and sat down, and she didn't say anything for a minute. She just sat there, and then she said, "Dad, I'm sorry for what I put you through." And I told her she didn't put me through anything, that it wasn't her fault. And she shook her head slowly and said, "I know what I did." And she wasn't being hard on herself in a performative way. She meant it. She was just being accurate. And I didn't argue with her because I think sometimes people need to be allowed to be accurate about what they did without someone rushing in to make them feel better before they've finished feeling what they feel. We sat for a while after that without talking much. I made coffee. We drank it. She asked how my health was, and I told her the truth, which was that it was about the same. The medication was doing what it was supposed to do. I had a follow-up appointment coming. I was managing, and she nodded, and I could see her thinking about the fact that I'd been managing alone here through all of it. And I didn't say anything about that, because there was nothing useful to say. Before she left, she stood in the doorway for a moment, and she said she wanted me to think about whether I'd be willing to try again, not moving back in with her. She wasn't asking that. She just meant being around each other more, dinners, coming over, being in each other's lives the way we used to be, and I told her I'd like that, and I meant it, because she is my daughter, and that doesn't have an off switch. Whatever happened didn't change what she is to me. It just changed some of what I understood about how things can go wrong even between people who love each other. I've thought a lot about what I would say if someone asked me to sum up what these past several months were, and I don't think I can sum it up cleanly because it doesn't feel clean. It feels like something I'm still carrying, not heavily, not in a way that stops me from getting through my days, but it's there. The way certain things stay with you not because they destroyed you, but because they showed you something about the limits of what trust can hold when someone decides to test it from the inside. And Jason knew exactly what he was doing. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He just applied pressure in one specific place over and over until something gave. And what gave was my daughter's certainty about her own father. And I think that's the part that I keep coming back to at 3 in the morning. Not that he did it. People do things. I've lived long enough to know that. But that it worked. That it was that easy. That a staged credit card withdrawal and one carefully placed sentence about not feeling safe was enough to make her ask me if I was a thief. And she loved me. She genuinely loved me. She wasn't cruel. She was just human and tired, and she didn't see what was happening until it was already done, and I understand that. I do. I understand it more than I wish I did. She's my daughter again. I mean that in the way that she was always my daughter, but now we're finding our way back to being easy with each other. And it's slow, slower than I thought it would be maybe. But it's real. Last week she called me just to talk. nothing specific, and we talked for 40 minutes about nothing in particular, and it felt close to normal. And I was grateful for that in a quiet way that I didn't say out loud. I just felt it. And that's probably enough. That's probably what this was always going to come down to. Not some clean resolution, not everything going back to exactly how it was. Just two people who love each other trying to remember how to trust that without having to check it every time. And I think we'll get there. I think we're already getting there. It's just going to take however long it takes. And at this point in my life, I'm not in a hurry to rush past anything.
This story is a perfect example of what we call gaslighting by proxy. Jason wasn't just lying to Emily, he was dismantling her internal compass. When she told her father, "I just don't know what's true anymore," she admitted Jason had one. She lost the ability to trust her own life experience. It's devastating because Daniel wasn't victimized by an enemy, but by his own child who couldn't protect her own sense of reality. The marriage ended, the money was returned, but that cold Daniel felt that night? That never truly goes away.